Right, good evening, everyone. I hope everyone is settled in and tuned into this evening's talk. Well, welcome to the fourth talk in West London Action for Children series of evening webinars. I'm Laurence Guinness, the Chief Executive of the Childhood Trust, and I'm delighted to host tonight's talk by Baroness Blower of Starch Green, who will discuss the virtues of education and gardening and the extent to which children in urban and suburban environments are cut off from the natural world. She will argue that much more should be done in schools about the environment and the climate crisis that we face. But before I introduce Christine, I'd like to say a few words about the marvellous West London Action for Children. Founded in 1917, West London Action for Children provides free counselling and therapy for vulnerable children and families in the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham and the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. They provide individual therapy to children, young people and parents, family therapy, as well as groups for parents, children in schools, dads and mindfulness groups. They also run a stay and play group weekly. The COVID-19 outbreak has had a really significant impact, in fact, devastating impact on many children with feelings of isolation, health and social anxiety for many of the children and families that West London Action for Children. Living conditions are a universal challenge, with so many families living in one room and otherwise poor quality housing. In this context, parents of younger children have felt that they're really struggling at home with their children, feeling guilty that they aren't doing enough and barely getting enough time to look after themselves. Children are suffering with really significant feelings of anxiety, with fear, tension, lack of peer support, not seeing their friends, family, relatives for a very long time. And teenagers are finding it really hard at the moment too, to motivate themselves with worries about exams and uncertainty for how long this is all going to last. So it's really, really important that the West London Action for Children services have been able to support many of their families through this. A lot of the work hasn't been able to take place during the time, but the therapists have been running groups, have been able to optimize their caseloads by taking on new clients and doing one-to-one work instead. So they've been really, have adapted very quickly and are doing excellent work. That, I must say, the Childhood Trust is helping to fund. They've started an online mindfulness group, and are about to start an online parenting group for fathers. So before I introduce Baroness Blower, when you think of a question, type it into the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen, and we want a lot of great questions. Great questions make for a great debate, great conversation. So don't be shy, ask a question. We won't read out your name, and the questions will all get answered as we go. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Baroness Christine Blower. Christine took her first teaching post at Holland Park School in 1973 and continued to work in West London for most of her teaching career. In 1990, with the demise of the Inner London Education Authority, she concentrated on working with young teenagers at risk of care or custody, and later took up a position as a member of the local authority's Behaviour Support Team. An active member of the National Union of Teachers throughout her teaching career, Christine was elected the National President of the Union and later General Secretary, the first woman to hold the position in the Union's history. Christine was nominated for a life peerage last year and was created Baroness Blower of Starch Green in October. So that's all the introductions done. It's over to you, Christine.
Laurence, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. It's a great privilege to go into the House of Lords, even though it's a rather odd place. And I was delighted when Jeremy Corbyn asked me if I would. And I thought hard about what name I would take. Blower, of course, because it is my name. And then Starch Green, because there is indeed a green at the end of Aspey Road, where I live, called Starch Green. So I'm delighted to have that title and to have something of the natural world in my title. So as Laurence said, when I first started teaching in 1973, I hadn't really given quite so much thought as I have today, a very long time later, to the absolute necessity for young people to think about the natural world and their connection with the natural world. I started teaching, as Laurence said, at Holland Park in an urban school. And I must say that, you know, the teachers and the teaching staff there the teaching assistants did a fantastic job, as teachers everywhere always do. And even throughout this period of lockdown, I concur absolutely with what Laurence has said about how difficult it has been for young people and indeed their parents and carers. But nonetheless, schools have been trying to do their very best. But it isn't the case that everything that young people need to know and to learn and to understand about can be taught or can be learned within the confines of a classroom. And I've gradually come to this over the years, partly because of my own absolute passion for gardening. When I first started teaching, I thought I would stay in teaching a little while, and then I thought I would go off and find myself a job as a horticulturalist. But actually, I enjoyed teaching so much that I didn't go off and become a horticulturalist. I stayed in teaching until I went in to work for the union. But I've always held to the view that Education International, which is the global union federation of all teachers' unions, the feeling that they have that education is a human and civil right and a public good. Now, it is of course a private good too, but the sense in which it's a public good must be concerned with the fact that children and young people need to be concerned with their own futures, of course, but also with the future of the planet. And that's why it's so important that we are concerned with the natural world. Now, many of you will know the phrase associated with W.B. Yeats. It's in doubt whether he actually really said it, but I like to think that he did, about education not being the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. And my own view is that quite a lot of what has gone on in education, particularly through the 80s and 90s and into the period that we're in now, is that it has taken the turn of children really being empty vessels and having to be filled with facts and information. And much of that, I think, has given rise to some of the things that we see now, some of the levels of anxiety that children have. Now, of course, that will have been massively exacerbated by what's been going on since the end of March, the fact that they haven't been in school, the fact that we've been involved in a pandemic. But even before then, the young people who find themselves referred to West London Action for Children are suffering excessive problems. But many children are anxious about school. And I think that part of that must be down to the fact that we're just not paying sufficient attention to all of the things that they need to know about what's going on in the world. Now, of course, in saying that, you could respond to me by saying, yes, but climate change is an existential crisis. Why would we want to be talking about that and making their lives worse? Well, precisely because if you're not armed with the information, then it's much harder to know what you can do about it in terms of a response. And that's why I think it's really important that children have this connection with the natural world, but also are actually being taught about what climate change is and how they can mitigate it. So I'm just going to give you a few examples of the kinds of things that I think that schools and teachers have done over the years, which have helped enormously in contributing to children's real connection with the natural world. And of course, some of them are examples from Scandinavia and indeed from the US, where they run forest schools. And some of you watching and listening may very well be quite familiar with forest school. And even though many children are at school in urban environments, they do have some experience of forest school by being taken out a couple of times over a couple of terms to go and do activities in wooded areas or in parks if they can't find a wooded area. But here are some of the things that I think have been really interesting that I've come across in my career. I was once very friendly with a primary head teacher, or rather a woman who became a primary head teacher, who was herself, like myself, a very committed gardener. And when she took up her post, outside her office window was a really rather attractive rose garden, although the roses had seen better days. And the rose garden had been out of bounds to many of the children. They were just simply not supposed to go there. It was just so that the head teacher can look out of the window and look at the roses. And after she'd been there a very short time, she decided that they would grow up and make the reasonably sized plot into a vegetable garden for children. So it would grow vegetables, but also it would be accessible to the children. It was a huge success. It was a massive success. The children grew things. I mean, they grew all kinds of things, but primarily they like to grow things that would grow reasonably quickly. So they started with cress and all those sorts of things. But over the years, they grew carrots, they grew courgettes, they grew cucumbers, they grew tomatoes, of course, although most of those ripened during the summer. And the children were allowed to pick the vegetables and take them home. And then the parents started offering to come in and do cooking sessions and so on. And it was the first time that some of those children actually realised where the vegetables that they had occasionally eaten had come from. Now, some of you will know that that there has been a school fruit and vegetable scheme. And I must say, early on in the scheme, when I was still teaching, there were children who simply, in some of our urban schools, who simply didn't recognise some of the vegetables as they came in raw. But when the government this year suspended the fruit and vegetable scheme, there was a massive outcry. In fact, I asked a question about it myself in the House of Lords, and the government has indeed reinstated it. Unfortunately, it's only for very small children, but I think that's the kind of thing, that is certainly the kind of thing that ought to happen in schools, that children should be afforded the opportunity to get a decent quality snack of fruit or vegetable. But also, I think more and more schools should find themselves involved in gardening projects. And one of the ways of doing that is by being involved with the Royal Horticultural Society, who have a gardening project. And in fact, lots and lots of primary schools end up taking gardening projects to the Royal Horticultural Society's flower shows, not this year, unfortunately, but they have in the past. And one of the things that you can learn thereby, by doing those kinds of projects, is precisely aspects to do with climate change, how it is that we're growing different things from the things that we used to be able to grow. And whilst climate change is a huge problem, it's also important that children understand that there are things which they can be doing which will mitigate against that. And of course, in this period of COVID-19, we have seen that the air has been cleaner, that people have been driving less, that people have been walking more, there have been fewer flights, and so there's been more bird song. And I fervently hope that we'll be able to hold on to some of those things, and that children and young people will realise the value of those things, and that thereby have a greater sense that their future is not all about misery, but it's actually something that's within their own hands. Another little story that I quite like about education was I watched a program that Jamie Oliver did when he was working with families who lived in a kind of shopping desert and didn't have many shops and were not able to go out and buy fresh vegetables terribly much. And I remember there was one episode where he'd asked one of the people who was going to be doing cooking with him, one of the parents, I think, to go to the supermarket and to buy some basil. And she went into the supermarket and bought the basil, or rather found the basil, found some basil, and she said to the camera operative, "It can't be this. This is just leaves." And she was very taken aback by the fact that he was going to cook with something which was just leaves. Now, I realise that that can be seen as a rather sniffy way of looking at things, but actually, you know, it seems to me that if we haven't taught kids in school that leaves are what you eat, then that's the problem for education. We ought really to be doing much more about gardening, much more about cooking, and much more about the natural world. And so, and the other thing is that I do genuinely believe that there is a magic about watching seeds grow. And I think that kids all just love it. I've never met a child who was not interested in putting things in pots or in water for that matter, and actually seeing them come up, whether it's cress or whether it's flowers. The Daffodil Society, for example, runs a competition every year for children to grow daffodils. And there is a great sense, I think, a terrific sense, once children have seen those first shoots come out, that they've done something absolutely remarkable, and indeed they have. Nelson Mandela, who was a great and passionate gardener himself, but also had a great concern for education, said on many occasions that education is the greatest, I don't know why he chose this word, but he said it, weapon, is the greatest weapon we have to change the world. And it seems to me that there is a very great deal about this world at this stage which needs changing. And that is why I've been so happy to be a teacher. I've been very happy to be associated with schools for the whole of my career, and why I genuinely believe that if we are doing much more in school about how we can make sure that we maintain biodiversity, about how we can make sure that we are thinking about solving the problems that the world has got rather than creating more problems, that actually we will be not just doing the planet a favour, but we will obviously be doing a favour for all of those children and young people who otherwise will be overcome with a great sense of the difficulties that they face, rather than the solutions that they can find to the challenges that we have. So that, in a nutshell, is why I'm so keen on gardening. It's why I'm so keen on making sure that children don't just sit at their desks, but are actually outside and getting their hands in the dirt and planting seeds and getting to recognise trees and hearing bird song and not being frightened of spiders and worms. And I think that over this period of time, when people have been out walking, when people have been in parks, there may just have been a bit of a renaissance of looking more at what is around us and about us. And it may be that as the lockdown went from spring into summer, and there's been such a lot of change, as there always is, that some young people may have found some solace in being able to go outside and look at those things. And as we return to school and return to our full-time education eventually over the autumn and winter terms, it seems to me that one of the things that we absolutely have to do is pay significant attention to children and young people's mental and emotional health, as well as their general kind of sociability and being able to be with their friends again. And that part of that must be about concentrating on a different type of curriculum, a curriculum that thinks about how much single-use plastic there is in the world and how we could do things better and differently, that thinks about making sure that our grass verges could be used for more interesting things than just grass, that we could actually rewild some of our parks and we could have some of our children and young people doing that, and we could be planting trees rather than cutting them down. There's so much more that can be said about education and about the natural world, but even for those who live outside of the environment of the inner city and the suburbs, even children who live in the country don't necessarily always find themselves being able to to really get out and enjoy the fields and the forests and the lakes and the rivers. And I would really like to see that as central to the curriculum that we use going forward. Of course, we want children to be literate and numerate. Of course, we want them to read the great works of literature. We want them to understand their history, all of their history. But we also want them to understand everything that there is to know about the natural world. And we can do that by making sure that we don't confine their learning just to the classroom, but that we spend time outside too. One of the nicest things that I ever heard anyone say about the curriculum was that the curriculum should be a mirror and a window, and that in schools and in education, a child and young person, when looking at the curriculum, should see themselves. It should be a mirror, but they should be able to look beyond their experience, beyond their immediate experience, through the window of the curriculum into so much more. And I think it is through those opportunities of looking beyond where you are and into the wider world that means that children can be resilient, can fulfill their real potential, and can begin to find solutions to the very many problems that we do all face. I'm going to see if Laurence has got any questions to ask me about any of that.
Yes, brilliant, Christy. There, magically appear. That was phenomenal. I really enjoyed listening to your views on kind of holistic education. You know, children who can situate themselves in the environment, in nature, locate themselves in that which is beyond the book. And beyond the whiteboard, or beyond the Chromebook as it is these days. Yeah. And I think that's ever more important. So, you know, you brought up so many really vital points in your talk. And one of the things that we touched on briefly before this webinar started was your time in the pupil behavioral unit. Mm-hmm. And, you know, a lot of my career in the charity sector has been working with children that have profound disturbances. Yeah. And, you know, and no child is born in a disturbed manner. You know, children develop these in response to their environmental conditions, social conditions, to the challenges that they have to endure. And I've seen, you know, myself, the restorative power of removing, you know, the boundaries, the physical boundaries that children find themselves in, you know, placed in. You know, we've endured lockdown for months now, but many children whose behavior is, you know, inadequate in a classroom, when you put them into nature, you put them into the forest, they can run around, something quite magical seems to happen.
Indeed. Indeed.
And tell us a little bit about your experience of that, and perhaps, you know, maybe one or two of the kids that you've witnessed this, because I think it's a very powerful thing when you see it.
I think the point that you make about behaviour being inappropriate in a classroom, but somehow and absolutely fine in nature. I mean, one of the things which the ILEA, the Inner London Education Authority, used to have was lots of centres outside of London, and children were often taken there on trips, and there was always a terrible fear. I mean, this is before I was in the Behaviour Support Team, but there was always a terrible fear that the child who was very badly behaved in the classroom could not possibly be taken. We can't possibly take this child because we don't know what they'll do. The fact is, you never know what urban children are going to do when you take them into the countryside until you get them there. And actually, some of the behaviours that were not very good for a classroom necessarily showed themselves as leadership skills once you got children into a different set of circumstances. And so at the very least, it seems to me that every child in the country ought to have an absolute entitlement to a week or two of some kind of residential experience in somewhere different. I mean, I would like to see all children having an experience of being able to do this forest school type stuff, you know, at least once a year, you know, for a couple of weeks or whatever. I mean, of course, in Scandinavia, I have friends who work in places where the children are brought to a car park by their parents in the morning. They're picked up by their teachers and they're taken into the woods, you know, whatever the weather. And we all know how people think that, you know, the Scandinavian countries generally are hugely successful, and you know, more successful societies too, and indeed they are. But I think one of the big things about working with children, my experience of working with children with what we used to call challenging or unsettled behaviour, was that a lot of the children I worked with found it very hard to share, found it very hard to, you know, if they got something, you know, because a lot of them didn't have very much, frankly, if they got something, they wanted to have it for themselves. And I found that one of the really good ways of dealing with that was, if they did grow something, you know, so lots of kids I work with grew cress, because you can grow it really quickly, and you could get them to grow 6 pots of cress, and they'd keep 1 for themselves and give 5 away. And you know, it was actually great for them to be able to give something away and say, this is something that I made or that I grew, and I'd like to share it with you. And I have to say the same is true of cooking. One of the things that I absolutely loved doing with kids, not just kids with difficult behaviour, but all sorts of kids, was to make biscuits in schools. Because again, you know, there's a kind of absolute joy in creating something, but there's also the sharing. And, you know, kids like to get biscuits from other kids. So I thought that was brilliant. And I have this great concern that too much of the kind of practical stuff has been taken out of both the primary phase, but also the secondary phase. You know, that kids don't get the chance to make things and share things. And so, yes, I think that the issue about children whose behaviour is not working well in the classroom is to say, well, is there anywhere in the school that we can see them having success with their behaviour? And that will quite often be literally outside the school building. I mean, at Phoenix High School, I have no idea how they use it now, but at Phoenix High School in Hammersmith and Fulham, they have something that they variously called the farm. I think it might be called the farm at the moment, and it's basically a kind of great big allotment. You know, where I think they probably haven't got any animals at the moment, but they have had in the past. And friends of mine who taught there, who taught their English lessons, for example, outside in what is essentially an allotment, said that there were lots of kids who, when they first went out, were hugely distracted by everything that was going on, but then just enjoyed being outside so much that they learned at least as much English or whatever it was that they were being taught, but also a whole lot of other extraneous things from just being in that environment. So, you know, I think there are very many positives. I'm sure you can remember, you must remember, be able to remember, Laurence, from your own school days. You know, the days when the teacher said, it's nice and warm outside, we'll go and read on the, you know, we'll go and sit on the playground or something, you know, instead of just being on your seats in the classroom.
Yeah, no, I have very fond memories of spending a lot of time outdoors, and was fortunate enough to grow up in Hertfordshire, and you know, the school I went to was surrounded by fields, and my own son's school, you know, primary school, was very progressive in the sense of ticked all the boxes. I think, you know, they had a little miniature horse there in the stable. They had goats, they had chickens.
Wow.
They had, you know, a big piece of land. They grew stuff all the time, and you know, I thought was you know, did all the things that and this was, you know, state primary school, and you know, especially in the inner cities now. Many of the head teachers I talk to have a growing awareness of the effect of congestion, of poor air quality. You know, one head teacher said, look, I want to show you something. She opened the cupboard and there were just rows upon rows of inhalers.
Yeah.
you know, she said, look, every year we add another row because there's more kids coming that need to have inhalers because the air quality is so poor. And if you know, this COVID crisis has shown us anything, that it's the appreciation of actually what the air is like when the planes aren't flying, when the traffic isn't moving.
Yeah.
And it's a significant problem. One of the questions I had, Christine, you know, you're in the House of Lords now. You're sitting and debates. You're talking about, you know, the weighty issues that affect the country, and this is very much in line with what, you know, the consequences of poor environment is these changes to permitted development in the terms of the Planning Act. We at the Childhood Trust did a project called the Bedrooms of London that documented children's living conditions, and it was a bit of a misnomer because none of the families were in none of the kids had bedrooms. They were all living in one room. Yeah. And we're seeing more and more now families, you know, children growing up literally in a one-room dwelling. It's meant to be temporary, but they've got nowhere else to go. There is nowhere else for them because there's just no other housing in London. And they become trapped there. And the consequences to children's education, their emotional well-being, their mental health is disastrous. What do you think we can do about this? Because look, we're not even talking about kids that don't have gardens. We're talking about kids that don't have any other space other than the bed they're sitting on.
Yeah.
And a little patch of floor. And this is a dire situation that's only going to get worse. So places like Connect House in Merton, I don't know if you're aware of these types of places, you know, industrial estates where there's office blocks that are now being converted into dwellings.
Yeah, let me say first of all that, I mean, when at the beginning, when the lockdown hit, the initial reaction of Hammersmith Council was to close all the parks. They closed all the parks for about 3 days. And lots of people, including myself, wrote to them saying, you cannot do this. You can't close the parks when we have so many people living, you know, in multi-occupancy buildings who've got, you know, they haven't even got a balcony, you know, the sorts of constituents that you're talking about. And actually then they did reopen the parks. And I think that Hammersmith and Fulham has been very good through this period of making sure that they have, you know, early on they had park wardens so that people weren't abusing social distancing and so on. But yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely alert to the fact that there is a huge problem of housing. I mean, the amount of housing overcrowding and the number of people who are homeless is, I mean, it's a scar on society really that we've still got this. And during the passage of the recent bill, I did work with Shelter and with Crisis about, mostly I'm bound to say about evictions, because obviously there'd been a period when people weren't being evicted, and it's quite likely that they will be. And we know that if people are evicted, they, you know, their housing situation just becomes worse. I have to say, I feel sort of as though I'm probably quite radical about this. I don't really see why we have empty houses. I mean, I don't know why it's not more easily possible for councils to simply get hold of, compulsorily purchase if necessary, houses that have stood empty for a long time, because there are plenty of them, and that's even without the sort of planning consent and changing things. There are going to be more and more office buildings which are going to be redundant as office buildings post-COVID, because there are lots of people who are saying that they won't go back and work in offices and that they will want to work remotely. And if they do go and work in office buildings, then they probably will only do it on a part-time basis. So provided that existing properties can be reasonably made into dwellings, that seems to me possibly a good short-term measure. But I mean, there is the issue about how good quality some of these buildings are, isn't there?
Absolutely. I mean, we've got, you know, people living in 15 square meters in absolutely tiny, you know, things that you would call cupboards, closets, whereby there's not even enough space for you know, a toddler to learn to walk. You know, there's children whose walking is actually been retarded because they didn't have enough space to learn to walk in. So this is a serious problem.
And there was news this week that there are dwellings being created that have no natural light whatsoever.
Yeah,
they're entirely in internal constructions. Now, I mean, I can't see that should be permissible in any kind of a, you know, that simply cannot be permissible, that the people live with no natural light whatsoever.
No, and you know, when you talk about growing things, you talk about, you know, children being in nature. This is the very antithesis of that, and it can only, you know, it can only have a terrible detrimental effect and further the inequalities of children that have all of this and those that have never seen this and have no chance of experiencing it. It's and that's the thing, you know, and that's that widening inequality gap. It's not just economic inequalities, it's the kinds of experiential and environmental inequalities that you've described, Christine, so very well in your talk.
I think it is remarkable that there are people in the current government who seem to have only just discovered the fact that there is inequality. So, you know, when they've been talking about the fact that schools have been closed, and they have now been closed, obviously, for a long time, and how they say, you know, we have to get the schools open because, you know, there is inequality, and this is, you know, children who are from poorer backgrounds, the equality gap is opening up for them. But it almost seems as though there are people in the Houses of Parliament who had no understanding that there was massive inequality before, and who simply didn't deal with this. So I'm sometimes a little surprised by some of the statements that I've heard recently from from ministers about wanting to reduce inequality, because frankly, if we hadn't had 10 years of massive austerity and no help for the poorest, then we wouldn't have the level of inequality that we've got now.
No, absolutely. Well, if you come across any that need to go and see some reality, Christine, send them our way, and we'll give them a healthy dose of reality. Right, we've got some great questions that have come in. We've got a rush of questions here. Let's start with the one of the early ones. How do you get older children or teens into horticulture and interested in the natural world?
How do you get them interested?
Older ones, yeah, the teens. You know, the
teens.
Sorry, the 15-year-olds. You know, the spotty 15-year-olds who don't want to watch telly and watch YouTube all day and play.
Okay, well, I mean, the thing is, if we had a different kind of curriculum and we had more going on, then we wouldn't be starting with 15-year-olds who had no interest to start with, because they would have come through it. But that's a cop-out answer. I mean, I think that I think we have to do it in different kinds of ways. One of the ways is just to talk about all of the plant-based things that there are, like, you know, where does all the stuff that we've got come from? And quite a lot of it is plant-based. And I think that we should do more of that in science, that they actually, you know, stuff that they have to know should be more linked into the natural world. I also think that we could do a lot more about talking about just being outside and health. I mean, without a doubt, there is a significant problem with poor diet amongst, you know, I mean, mostly amongst the poorer sections of society, but also, you know, there are plenty of slightly better off kids who don't eat properly, and so I think that health, fitness, and diet is something that could be attractive to young people. I think showing them things like the fact that lots of economies have been distorted by growing tobacco, and how bad tobacco is for them. You know, you soak cigarettes and get the nicotine out of it, and offer it to them to smell. It's really disgusting. And I think they can find out a lot about plants by learning about the bad things. But I mean, of course, I absolutely recognise that it's not an easy thing to do. But then on the other hand, you know, it's not easy to get 15-year-olds necessarily engaged in anything if they're just on a diet of being on a screen and computer games. So, you know, I think we just have to find lots and lots of ways of doing it.
Well, here's a way that might stimulate them to get out of, you know, get away from their screens. Do you think children and young people should support Extinction Rebellion with their belief in civil disobedience?
I do think that. I think that they should certainly find out about Extinction Rebellion. Absolutely, absolutely, they should. And actually, a lot of people who are active in this particular borough in Extinction Rebellion are also being involved in, you know, a lot of activities with the council about making sure the council is carbon neutral by 2030. And so I'm in favour of that. Yeah, I think that children and young people do have to learn that there is a certain amount of civil disobedience, which is non-violent, which has a very proud tradition and history, and is absolutely something that you have to do if you want to make the case for things being different. And without a doubt, they have to be different. Extinction Rebellion do a very, very interesting initial talk, and I think it would help a lot of kids, particularly the older kids I'm talking about now, if they realised, you know, for example, the difference between how many wild animals versus domesticated animals there were, and how the obverse proportions of those, and of course the loss of the Amazon rainforest. I think people are quite struck by things like that.
Absolutely. Now, here's a question that I'm sure you're going to have a lot to say about, and it's about someone's asked, how do you feel about diversifying the curriculum to include more on the natural world? How do you think that fits in with the culture of SATs and league tables and the emphasis on measurement and performance?
Well, the short answer to that is I don't think it necessarily does. I mean, there's I've never been a fan of SATs, and it's really interesting that this year one of the education ministers said to the parents of Year 6 children, it doesn't matter that your children are not doing SATs, because really they're only about measuring schools. They're not about measuring your children. So, you know, if the cat was ever in the bag, it's definitely out of the bag now. Schools have, you know, slight areas of weakness in some part of their curriculum or some part of their practice, and there'll be a school next door that's very good at that, but they might not be quite so good at something else. So the idea of all going to be staying on until they're 18 or 19, then pushing them through an exam at 16 doesn't seem very sensible. Have a rite of passage if you need it in some other kind of way, but it doesn't necessarily seem sensible to have a whole series of complex exams at 16 that's being had elsewhere.
No, absolutely, and perhaps that rite of passage could include growing a complete table of food and serving it to your fellow pupils.
Well, yeah, or you know, or going
in the forest, you know.
Fortnight in the forest, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
It does in Scandinavia, by the way.
I'm sure.
The kind of thing they do, yeah.
Yeah. Someone has asked, are we not going full circle here? It says in the past, subjects like home economics were part of the curriculum, but were targeted in education cuts. Also, one hears that health and safety concerns have reduced the number of external trips. How can government be persuaded to change tack?
Oh, look, I'm as keen as anybody else that children should be healthy and safe. But I do think having to fill out a 35-page risk assessment to walk children across the road to the park is ridiculous. And I'm exaggerating for the purposes of example there. But I mean, yeah, I think the whole question of risk assessment, it has put some people off taking kids out at all. And I agree about home economics. I mean, that we used to have home economics, we used to have making things out of wood, we used to have needlework, we used to have technical drawing, we used to have all of those things. Not in separate technical schools, but actually just in the comprehensive school. And we used to have cooking in primary schools, and then we started to call everything technology instead of it being about actually making things. And I think there is a bit of a full circle thing. Although I don't think we've ever had enough of a focus on the world beyond school. I think that learning in the environment, about the environment, has never been a sufficient focus. Although I do know that in counties like Lincolnshire and Cambridgeshire, they used to run something called rural science, which did have a kind of focus on, market gardening and small animal husbandry and things. And, those are not things that you can do very easily in London, but you can certainly grow a lot of things on a window box or in a raised bed.
Absolutely. We've got, well, the last question that someone's put forward is very similar to the question you just answered. So it's about how can we influence a change to the school curriculum to include more about the natural world, but I think you already answered.
Yeah.
Already answered that.
And it seems to me that what we have to, my answer to this really is that and this is a little thing that I've been trying to get people to be enthusiastic about. It seems to me that the curriculum should not be something that they decide on in Westminster, in Whitehall. It seems to me that we should have something like a national council for the curriculum and assessment, so that all of the voices in and about education should be thinking about what the curriculum should look like. So that should be teachers, of course, through their unions. It should be the leadership of schools, but it should also be parents, and it should be students themselves, and it should be academics who look and say, what is it that we need to teach, and what is it that young people need to learn, and how can we to some extent have some student-led learning as well as just kind of what we've got now in the curriculum, which is much more teacher and teacher-focused learning. I must say, the sorts of life circumstances that you're talking about for young people and children and young people mean that they have very little access to play. And it seems to me that one of the things that we're talking about when we're talking about experiential learning is that children and young people have to have the opportunity to play. And a play-based curriculum in the early years, which is not just go outside and run around children. I mean, it's much more structured than that, but it is a lot of it comes from the children. Is, I think, a very it's absolutely the right way to consider the curriculum. And I once heard a brilliant speech at NUT conference talking about play-based curriculum. And the young woman who gave the speech said, I think play is so important that children should do it, but adolescents should do it, and adults should do it too. She said, but when I Googled adult play, I won't tell you what I got. On that note, I will finish.
Yeah,
Laurence.
That's fantastic, Christine. That's been a great talk. Thank you very much. We've learned a lot about you, about your thoughts, and particularly about children and the environment, and what children are lacking currently, I believe. So now's the time I'm going to talk to everyone that's listening, and urge everyone who's enjoyed this talk to spare a thought for those children and families at home who we've been talking about, who are struggling with poverty, anxiety, depression, even suicidal thoughts, and the many other emotional and psychological difficulties that West London Action for Children's work addresses. You can make a real difference right now to the life of a child who needs support. Please go to the West London Action for Children's website now or after this talk and sign up for a small monthly donation. It'll be the best money you've ever spent, I promise you, and you really won't miss it, but it will make a huge difference to the work for West London Action for Children. And before we wrap up completely, I'd like to tell you all about next week's brilliant talk. This was the fifth in the series. This was the fourth in the series. Sorry. Next week we've got the fifth in the weekly summer series, and we'll have Dr. Benjamin Obadiah Iqbal Zephaniah. Benjamin was born and raised in Birmingham, England. He cannot remember a time when he was not creating poetry, but this had nothing to do with school, and where poetry meant very little to him. In fact, he'd finished his full-time education by the age of 13. His poetry is strongly influenced by the music and poetry of Jamaica and what he calls street politics. Cutting-edge performance poet Benjamin Zephaniah has written poems about 12 children from all over Britain who come from a whole range of cultural backgrounds. His new work is full of photos and facts about kids, and this is the rhyming, rapping, rhythmic way to learn about Britain in the 21st century. And this will all be next week for your education and entertainment. Benjamin Zephaniah next week. Thank you so much, Christine, for a brilliant talk. Thank you to everyone that came tonight and listened, and for the great questions. Don't forget to donate, and we will see you all next week. And that's it from West London Action for Children. Enjoy your evenings. Have a great evening. All the best.